thank you all for coming out this evening. I consider it a great privilege and honor to be invited to give the keynote presentation here for this conference. It is, in fact, a particular pleasure because of the presence of the man with whom I studied economics longer than both of us would like to think about, Peter Kennan. I was just reminding Peter that of the first class that I ever took with him, which was the first class that he ever taught at Columbia University. And it was that class that persuaded me to major in economics and go on for a PhD in that subject. And I stayed at Columbia for that PhD because of Peter. And I've never regretted that decision for a moment. And it's a great pleasure to look forward to hearing his remarks tomorrow afternoon. We're in effect something like bookends for this conference. The subject of the conference is a very challenging one. Global currency competition and exchange rate arrangements, present and future. That covers a lot, right? It actually covers all of the major elements of what we used to call the international monetary system, or more recently people talk about the international financial architecture. Currencies and exchange rates are at the center of what we mean by the global monetary system. What could be more challenging than this set of issues? The fact that this conference is taking place implies that current arrangements are in some sense deficient and might be improved. That the system may in fact be in need of reform. We have one paper that is entitled Towards a Bretton Woods III, ? And then we have Peter's paper on the renovation of the global currency regime. Clearly, there is a sense that there is or are problems out there. Conventional view out there in the world is summarized by this quotation: "A fundamental reform of the international monetary system has long been overdue. Its necessity and urgency are further highlighted by the imminent threat to the once mighty US dollar." That sounds very contemporary, doesn't it? If we had the time, I'd be tempted to go around the room and ask if you could guess what figure was responsible for that quotation. It might amuse you to know that it was Robert Triffin, almost exactly 50 years ago. Plus ça change, plus ça la même chose. Ecclesiastes says there's nothing new under the sun. Well, that's not exactly true, but it does suggest that, the fact is that people have been talking about monetary reform for a very long time. Reform has been an issue going back a long time. It's not a new question, reforming the international monetary system. But of course, that doesn't mean that it's useless to talk about the subject, because clearly the issue remains. Much has changed over 50 years since Robert Triffin wrote. As I'm sure Peter will agree with me, one of the few advantages of age is that we can remember over a long period of time how much has changed. 50 years ago, when Triffin said that, there were fixed exchange rates. The dollar was convertible into gold. Capital markets were controlled with capital controls of various kinds. We were just beginning to talk about this odd thing that became known as the euro currency market. The euro hadn't been born yet. China and monetary relations never appeared in the same sentence. And how things have changed in that respect. Clearly, there has been a great deal of change. Clearly, there is much to discuss. And I'm glad that we do have the opportunity here over the course of this conference tomorrow to discuss a number of the critical issues that are in debate right now, including the role of the euro. Several papers will be devoted to the euro. And of course, the issue of the Chinese exchange rate, the exchange rate of the renminbi, which will also be the subject of a presentation tomorrow. Now, purpose of a keynote presentation is presumably to set the stage, to kind of give a tour d'horizon of the issues, and to create a context, or to highlight the context in which these various papers will be presented and discussed tomorrow. What I want to do is to try to go behind the scenes, if it were, and to try to emphasize what I see as the underlying context for these various issues involving the euro, China's exchange rate, and others. And I would argue that the critical issue is the issue of governance. That what we are talking about is the rules of the game. If we're talking about reform, if we're talking about improvement, if we're talking about trying to deal with problems, we're talking about formulating rules or implementing rules or enforcing rules. That's what governance is all about. It's all about the formulation, implementation, and enforcement of the rules of the game. In short, the question is who's in charge? Or who's in charge of making the rules that are supposed to be in charge? I like to talk to my students when talking about the issue of governance, to talk about The Wizard of Oz. This was one of my favorite books as a child. You know, there was a movie made out of it with Judy Garland. You may not know that The Wizard of Oz actually is an allegory, or at least there is a theory that The Wizard of Oz is actually an allegory. Ultimately, in the end, we find out that somebody is in charge. It's the Wizard of Oz, who's behind this screen and responsible for all the special effects that were going on. The allegory is actually about the debates that were going on in the United States at the end of the 19th century over the gold standard versus bimetallism. The yellow brick road could be understood as emphasizing the role of gold. The silver slippers that Dorothy wore, though they were ruby in the movie because it looked better, the silver slippers were, of course, silver. The Tin Man was stood for the working class, the labor class. The Straw Man was for the farmers. The Cowardly Lion was William Jennings Bryan. And the wizard behind the screen was, of course, McKinley, President McKinley. Frank Baum, who wrote The Wizard of Oz, clearly was in favor of bimetallism and not the gold standard. But the whole book, turns out, was about governance. It was about who's in charge. It was about who was running the show. And that's what all of our discussion of the monetary system is about. It's about the rules. It's about governance. So in these remarks, what I'd like to do, I have a very simple agenda. I want to talk about the meaning of global monetary governance, and then I want to talk about the past, the present, and the future. And I'm going to try to do it all in about a half hour. Ambitious, clearly also has to be concise. I clearly am going to have to be brief. I'll have to pass over issues fairly quickly. And of course, that means that we could have some very interesting conversation later afterwards in Q&A about specific points that may be of interest to you. In talking about history as quickly as I must in this presentation, I'm always reminded of an experience I had back when I was teaching at Princeton in the 1960s. I was asked one summer to participate as a faculty member in a training program for Peace Corps volunteers who were on their way to Turkey. And they had to have a certain amount of hours of instruction in Turkish language and a variety of other things, including Turkish history, all of 2 hours on the history of Turkey. 2 hours on the history of Turkey. Because everything was being crammed in here. So they had one lecture up to Ataturk and one from Ataturk to the present. Students thought that was a bit brisk. And at the end of the program, there was a pageant where various participants in this program on their way to Turkey who had talents of one kind or another appeared on stage. And one person came out and stood behind a lectern like this, addressing the audience as the volunteers of the Turkish Peace Corps about to go to the United States. And he said, ladies and gentlemen of the Turkish Peace Corps, before you leave for the United States, we feel you should have a lecture on the history of the United States. So, Columbus discovered America in 1492. Now, moving on to the Vietnam War. And I fear that that's about what I have in mind here. But let me start with the meaning of global monetary governance. The critical point to bear in mind is that we live in what political scientists would call a Westphalian world. That is to say, world politics is divided up into territorially defined sovereign states. The idea of this particular mode of organization of world politics goes back to the Peace of Westphalia of 1648 and is therefore dubbed the Westphalian system. Whatever you want to call it, the system of nation states, the Westphalian world. In formal terms, what this means is that we live with anarchy at the global level because there is no central authority. In formal terms, there is no central authority, no one at the top, because sovereignty at the state level prevails. And if sovereignty means anything, it means that ultimately, in one way or another, the state can do what it wants without any constraint, in principle, without any constraint from elsewhere. What that means then is that governance must rely on some form of cooperative behavior among those sovereign governments, more or less institutionalized cooperation. And the principal implication of that is that compromises, therefore, are inevitable to accommodate the demands of national sovereignty. It is inevitable that states will have conflicting interests. It's rare that all interests are harmonious, even for a brief time. And so compromises are necessary, and if compromises are involved, inevitably, therefore, then the system is suboptimal, which is to say, we can always talk about reform. Robert Triffin 50 years ago talked about reform, and we've talked about reform on and off ever since. If the system is suboptimal, there's always room for improvement, and therefore always room for reform. So if anybody was wondering whether the subject of this conference is important, I hope I've laid that to rest. It is important. Now, I would argue that global monetary governance has four essential elements. The first three here will be familiar to Peter Kennan, among others. The first three were identified by a group of 30 economists gathered together by Fritz Machlup of Princeton University in 1963, and Peter was one of them, who took up the challenge that Triffin had laid down in Gold and the Dollar Crisis, and said, okay, let's try to understand what are the issues. And the issues, they argued, were adjustment, liquidity, and confidence. I add a fourth, because I have become a political economist, and so I think politics matters. More importantly, I think that cooperation among sovereign states is unlikely to happen spontaneously. That if governance consists of cooperation among sovereign states, it has to be engineered in some way. It has to be led in some way. It requires some form of leadership, some form of exercise of power for that cooperation to occur. Adjustment, central to the international monetary system, has to do with the management of payments relations between countries. It's concerned with payments imbalances and their adjustment. The core issue clearly is the management of exchange rates, because the exchange rate regime, whatever exchange rate regime we have, dictates the ways in which governments can deal with deficits or surpluses in their balance of payments. Liquidity has to do, of course, with the management of the supply of financing for balance of payments imbalances, because you cannot eliminate imbalances overnight. Confidence has to do with maintaining trust in the principal instruments of liquidity, of balance of payments financing. And finally, as I say, I think leadership is also an important element. Now, going to the past, we date the contemporary international monetary system to Bretton Woods, to the Bretton Woods Conference of July-August 1944, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Actually 45 countries were involved, 44 allied nations and one neutral, Argentina. And their discussions took place over 6 weeks. Most of what was decided there had been resolved in advance through the correspondence between John Maynard Keynes of the UK Treasury and Harry Dexter White in Washington. A correspondence that began, remarkably enough, as early as the spring of 1942. Just think about that, actually. Think about the optimism that was implied there. The U.S. entered the war in December of 1941. In the spring of 1942, Stalingrad had not yet occurred. The Battle of Midway had not yet occurred. El Alamein had not yet occurred. It was not at all clear who was going to win that war. And yet there they were, exchanging correspondence and memos about the design of a post-war international monetary system. And that went on for 2.5 years. At Bretton Woods, what was decided was a system for international monetary relations, which was in many ways remarkably smart. I mean, not surprising given who was involved. But the critical element was that it was very state-centric. From a political economy point of view, what was critical here was that it was to be managed by states. States were the governments of states were to make the critical decisions, either directly or through their agents, the IMF being their principal agent. And the rules were to be clear and transparent. It was to be a well-oiled machine, in effect. On the issue of adjustment, Article 4 of the Charter of the IMF established the idea that governments should have fixed exchange rates, should have declared par values. On liquidity, it was said, that was the whole purpose, to create the creation of the International Monetary Fund, was to create a source of liquidity. In both cases, states would be making the principal decisions on if a par value system was to be established. It meant that states, the governments of states, would determine the value of a currency and maintain the value of that currency. States would be responsible. Likewise, the International Monetary Fund, an intergovernmental organization ultimately answerable to its principals, the governments of states, again, through the IMF, states would be making the principal decisions about access to liquidity. As far as confidence was concerned, there was no question at the time that the dollar, the principal instrument of liquidity, no one questioned it. It was as good as gold. In fact, some people turned it around and said, you know, if gold was accepted, it was because it was as good as the dollar. And then, of course, leadership. There was no question that there was leadership at the time, leadership jointly by the United States and Britain as a junior partner, and later expanded to the group of 5, and then 6, and then 7. Moving on to the Vietnam War. What happened over the next 60 or so years? Well, what happened in my interpretation is that over time, the system became less and less state-centric and more privatized, which is to say, more and more the critical decisions involved in the governance of monetary relations came to be exercised by private market agents rather than by governments. In 1973, you'll recall, following the breakdown of the Smithsonian Agreement, the major currencies all began to float. Ultimately, the Article 4 was, of the Charter was amended so that governments could now have a very wide choice of exchange rate regimes. Indeed, the one choice that was forbidden, pegging to gold, was the one choice that everybody had been expected to do under the original par value system. And it was subject only to this notion that their decisions would be subject to quote-unquote firm surveillance by the IMF. But what this meant is that to the extent that governments allowed greater flexibility of their exchange rates, up to and including dirty or clean floats, what they were doing was, in effect, ceding their power to market actors. It was not government or governments that would determine exchange rates, but private market actors through the decentralized decision-making process of the foreign exchange market. system of determination of exchange rates became increasingly privatized. Likewise, liquidity. Over the decades since Bretton Woods, particularly since the 1960s, capital mobility has increased. First as a result of the development of the euro currency market, and then the reduction of national capital controls, elimination of national capital controls, financial market liberalization. The result was that more and more countries found that there was an alternative to the IMF. If they needed liquidity to finance deficits, many now could go to the markets. In the 1970s, Latin American countries went big time for syndicated bank loans. More recently, it's been primarily through bonds, but the point is that governments now had an alternative to the IMF, an alternative where access was determined not by states, but by private markets, by the decentralized decision-making process of the financial markets. Again, therefore, privatization. But of course, with the very recognizable consequence that now access to liquidity might vary considerably, at times being excessive, as in, for example, the 70s, or in the period running up to 2007. At other times, times of crisis, such as after 1982 or since 2007, suddenly inadequate supply of liquidity. Financial markets create an alternative to the IMF, but they are subject and prone to crises, and that creates a major issue for consideration. In both cases, in the case of exchange rates, the new privatized exchange rate regime, and in the emergence of international financial markets as an alternative to the IMF, what we have is a growth of uncertainty. In comparison, in contrast rather, with the design of Bretton Woods, which was for a set of rules that were to be clear and transparent. Now, things are much more murky. We really don't know what the market view on exchange rates will be from day to day. We really don't know what the markets, what access there will be for governments in the financial markets from day to day. 6 months ago, Greece was borrowing without difficulty. And then suddenly, that whole situation changed. I remember the finance minister of Mexico in 1995, when Mexico was in crisis, saying, a year ago I went to the IMF annual meeting and they were all beating on my door asking me to borrow, to borrow from them. And now nobody wants to talk to me. You know, that is the way, that is the uncertainty that's associated with this. And that in turn leads to a couple of other issues. As far as the confidence issue is concerned, clearly we have less certainty now about the value of the principal instrument of liquidity, the dollar, but at the same time there doesn't seem to be any clear alternative. I'll return to that. And then, of course, on the issue of leadership, one of the most notable results of the recent crisis, recent and present crisis, is the extent to which decision-making has shifted from the group of 7 to the group of 20. But in the group of 20, we really don't know who really is in charge. We really don't know who is the wizard behind the screen. We don't know because it's such a large group. They haven't really sorted out their decision-making procedures. And as the recent meeting of finance ministers and central bank governors testifies, they have not yet found a way to overcome differences by anything other than anodyne communicators. So, what are the current challenges? The current challenges are fairly clear, at least they are to me. As far as adjustment is concerned, if we're going to live with an exchange rate regime which allows for such a wide range of choice and such a high degree of uncertainty about who's actually, what exchange rates ought to be or what they will be from day to day, the only way that we can ensure that exchange rates don't behave in a way which is counterproductive is to exercise greater surveillance over the policy choices of governments. It's fairly clear that if we are going to gain any kind of degree of management over an exchange rate regime that is essentially privatized, we need to have a more effective surveillance. Article 4 calls for IMF surveillance, but it has not until now been effective. It's been ineffectual. The question is, can it be strengthened? On liquidity, if the markets are going to continue to be a major alternative for many governments, the preferred alternative to the IMF as a source of liquidity, and the markets themselves are prone to excessive swings of abundance of lending followed by scarcity of lending, if market crises are going to be one of the prices we pay for access to that liquidity, then we have to ask ourselves about the issues of crisis prevention and crisis management. On confidence, Triffin was right. The dollar wasn't, in 1960, it wasn't what it had once been, and it clearly is not now what it was in 1960. But the question remains, what comes after the dollar? That question remains very open, as the recent debate suggests. Finally, leadership. Can the group of 20 work effectively? We really don't know whether this group, as large as it is going to be able to provide effective leadership for the world economy. Organizational theory is very clear. If you increase the number of people at the table, the number of people involved in an executive committee, group of 20 can be considered to be an executive committee, a leadership group. You increase arithmetically the number of people involved, you increase the difficulty of reaching settlement, reaching decisions exponentially. And going from a G2 at Bretton Woods to a G5, 6, 7, now to a group of 20, which actually is more like, what, 37, because one of the 20 is the EU. The number of decision makers is so large now, it's more like a mini parliament. There was an economist named Richard Baldwin who was writing about the governing council of the European Central Bank, something that is familiar to Amy and others here. The issue of the large size of the governing council of the European Central Bank. And he said, the size is so large that it's difficult to imagine how they could make a decision about where to go to dinner, let alone make monetary policy for a group of 400 million people. The G20 is in a somewhat similar situation. It's so large, it's not really clear what kind of effective decision-making process will come out of it. Now, I want to say a little more about each of these challenges. First, the issue of surveillance. Little history here. The Article 4, when it was revised, amended in 1976, this was the second amendment to the Articles of Agreement of the IMF, the first being the article that or set of articles that created the SDR. It calls, as I said, for firm surveillance by the IMF. Governments were allowed a variety of choice, but they were to avoid manipulation of their exchange rate. And to minimize that risk, the IMF was to exercise firm surveillance. And a year later, in 1977, what they call the 1977 decision, they actually outlined a number of criteria that would trigger discussions, quote unquote, or consultations, quote unquote, with individual governments. One of those criteria, for example, would have been, quote, protracted large-scale intervention in one direction in the exchange markets. Paul Bowles, China might come to mind when hearing that protracted large-scale intervention in one direction in the exchange markets. 20 years later, the IMF added a new decision, adding a new criterion to trigger consultation or discussion with a government. Criterion of external stability, the notion that countries' policies should not generate disruptive exchange rate movements. Now, this was passed over the protests of the Chinese government, and it was clearly aimed at China, but it hasn't improved the effectiveness or surveillance any. The IMF has still tiptoed around it and has not, in fact, had any significant impact on the behavior of China, or for that matter, any other large government. The superficial reason, of course, is that there is a standoff between the United States and China. As long as those two major powers cannot agree, it's unlikely that the IMF is going to speak up against either of them. But the more fundamental reason is that the IMF has not been given real authority, hasn't been given enforcement powers. It hasn't. It's a set of rules about not having extended, protracted intervention, not creating external instability, and so on. The rules are fairly clear. It's just that there are no teeth. The IMF is not given any significant authority. The question is, could it ever be given enough authority to really change the policies of a country like China, or for that matter, the United States? To be effective, the IMF would have to be in a position where it could feel free to name and shame, to actually issue statements saying, you are in violation of the rules, and to bring public pressure to bear on a government to change its ways. Simply to say that is to acknowledge that sovereign governments, particularly large sovereign governments, are probably unlikely to give the IMF that kind of authority. Again, as I say, governance without government requires cooperation among existing governments, national governments, and without their willingness to accept a constraint on their sovereignty, it's unlikely the IMF would be able to get that authority. An alternative exists, of course, in a setting like the Group of 20. The Group of 20 has actually talked about creating an alternative using peer pressure, quote unquote. They actually have agreed on, this is a mouthful, a framework for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. A framework for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. Reminds me, of course, of the Stability and Growth Pact, which has provided neither stability nor growth. There has been this talk about a mutual assessment peer review process within the Group of 20, in principle committing all the members of the Group of 20 to work together to evaluate whether their policies are collectively consistent with sustainable and balanced growth, all of which sounds very good in communiques. And if you think that this is actually going to happen, then there's this bridge in Brooklyn that I'm looking to sell that I'd be happy to talk to you about. I'm not an optimist that governments will actually submit to that kind of peer pressure. And so we continue to live with a great deal of uncertainty in the exchange rate regime. Liquidity, the market management. The issue here is crisis management, crisis prevention. And as you know, this has been on the front burner since the beginning of the financial crisis in 2007, the global crisis. Many ideas out there, as you well know. Gordon Brown floated the idea of a financial transactions tax, a variation on the old Tobin tax, tougher capital requirements, improvements in liquidity management, variations on the theme of macro-prudential regulation, and so on. Regrettably, for all the skill of those who have come up with various kinds of technical proposals, regrettably, once again, there's been relatively little progress. There have been some initiatives at the individual national level, The U.S. is probably within the month going to have new legislation approved by both houses of Congress that will improve financial regulation at the national level in the United States. And there have been moves elsewhere. Germany has banned naked short selling. But the fact is that at the global level, there has been a failure to agree on any set of proposals. I mentioned the recent meeting of the group of 20 finance ministers and central bank governors that took place in Busan, Korea, Republic of Korea, just, I guess, last weekend. High on the agenda for that meeting was the issue of market management. Two major proposals under discussion involved capital requirements and a bank tax. The bank tax was opposed by the government of the country in which we are now located. And the result was that they punted. They chose to agree to disagree. And no recommendation came forward. There is probably going to be a new Basel, a Basel III, to tighten up capital requirements yet again. There probably will be variations in different countries of a new bank tax. Again, we live with a great deal of uncertainty. In the words of the latest Global Financial Stability Report from the Financial Stability Board, quote, "We are still living with regulatory uncertainty." And then, of course, adding to all of this is the looming issue of sovereign debt. You know, one of the characteristics of a financial crisis like the one that we've been living through is that it's triggered by an accumulation of debt. In this case, it was debt in the private sector. High levels of debt, personal debt, high levels of corporate debt, high levels of debt in financial institutions, levels of leverage that were really quite astronomical. And part of the response to a crisis triggered by such high levels of leverage, high levels of debt, is that the private sector tries to work itself back down, try to reduce that level of debt, to deleverage, which of course also implies lower levels of spending, since more revenue has to be set aside for write-offs or for debt retirement. The slack, therefore, gets picked up by the public sector through fiscal stimulus, and that's exactly what all of our governments did to a greater or lesser extent after 2007. Governments engaged in deficit spending. Keynesianism came back, and we were all happy about it because it meant that we were hopefully going to avoid a Great Depression again. Quite reasonable under the circumstances. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have had those fiscal stimulus programs, quite the contrary. But it has clearly created a situation in which the deleveraging by the private sector has been matched by much higher levels of leverage, i.e. debt, in the public sector. And in some cases, such as Greece, or I think Portugal might possibly fit in this category, the levels may be too high. And we live with fear about public debt. What was it, last Friday or the week before, the Friday of the week before? One politician in the new government in Hungary made a remark which was clearly intended for domestic political consumption and triggered a 3% decline in global stock markets. The markets are very, very much on edge right now over the issue of sovereign debt. Again, in the words of the Global Financial Stability Report, vulnerabilities now increasingly emanate from concerns over the sustainability of governments' balance sheets. And this is going to be a problem for us for some time. I personally feel that what the EU has done to stabilize the situation in Greece and hopefully avert similar situations in Portugal or Ireland or Spain, or Hungary for that matter, I personally think that at best the new Financial Stability Fund has bought, what is it? Facility, sorry. Financial Stability Facility. Stabilization Facility or Stability or whatever. FSF. FSF. I wrote about a different FSF back in the 1970s, the OECD's proposal, but that was a different story. I think that at best the EU has bought some time. My personal feeling is that the numbers in Greece just don't add up and that a restructuring of Greek debt is inevitable, and when it does come, that we will be once again dealing with other countries as well. But you may disagree. On the issue of the dollar, it's clear that the dollar can no longer dominate in currency relations around the world the way it once did. That seems clear. But to be replaced, there has to be an alternative. For the greenback to disappear, there has to be another candidate waiting in the wings, ready to take over. When sterling went into decline, and we have to remember how long that decline was, but when it went into decline, there was a clear alternative, the dollar. But ask yourself about the alternatives today. The euro? I've been writing for some time about, although Amy and I disagree on this, I've been writing for some time about the deficiencies of the euro that make it unattractive as a long-term alternative to the US dollar as an international currency. And I think that the recent events, starting 2 years ago, with the inability to agree on any kind of coordination of fiscal stimulus and failure to agree on a coordinated approach to resolving issues in the banking systems of Europe. It demonstrates that the governance mechanism of the Eurozone is flawed, perhaps fatally flawed. I honestly don't believe, though there are, we just heard from Kurt that some British politicians are suggesting the Eurozone will come to an end, and others have been suggesting that. Paul Volcker gave a speech in London about a month ago in which he said that there was now a very high risk that the Eurozone could come apart. I personally don't think that's going to happen. What I tell my students is I don't think the euro will fail because I think that the political commitment to it is simply too deep. But I don't think it'll succeed either because of the deficiencies of in its structure, an anti-growth bias built into provisions for both monetary and fiscal policy, but most importantly, the ambiguities of its governance structure. I find it very difficult to imagine the euro replacing the dollar as a global currency. The yen, I think, the yen reached its peak 25 years ago during the bubble economy of the 1980s. I don't think anyone really imagines that the yen could come back to replace the dollar. The yuan, if China's growth continues for another 20 years the way it has for the past 20 years, and China's financial markets develop, China's capital controls are relaxed, perhaps, but certainly not in the immediate future. What about a global currency? The SDR, some new version of the SDR, or some completely new global currency. Certainly the idea has attracted attention. The central bank governor in China has proposed it. Peter has been writing about the SDR. The idea has been promoted by a UN commission of experts that was chaired by Joe Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize laureate. UNCTAD has come out in favor of it. To my mind, again, because political economy is what I like to do, to my mind, the problem with a new global currency, thinking about a new global currency, is who would control it? How would the decisions be made? Would it be possible for governments to decide on an effective governance mechanism for the control of global liquidity? If the euro, the countries of the Eurozone with their established institutions going back 50 years, have found it difficult to compromise sufficiently to have an effective governance structure, how much more difficult would it be for 192 members of the IMF? I find that implausible. So my conclusion is that we are heading toward what I call a leaderless currency system, a system in which the dollar remains primus inter pares, but by a much more narrow margin. There's much more competition between the dollar and several alternatives, but no clearly dominant leader. And that, again, means a higher degree of uncertainty. And finally, leadership. In matters like governance of the international monetary system, two factors are critical. One is that there has to be, once again, this has to do with the fact that we live in a Westphalian system, that governance without government requires cooperation between national authorities, more or less institutionalized cooperation. There has to be a willingness to compromise, a willingness to act in common interest. That requires a consensus on basic principles. And secondly, it requires to some degree a concentration of power, because without a concentration of power, you don't have any actor capable of cajoling or coercing or persuading various parties to come together. Just think about the Bretton Woods Conference. What made Bretton Woods so successful? First, it was the fact that there were these two conditions. First, there was consensus on basic principles. In the very year of the Bretton Woods Conference, the book was published, International Currency Experience, variously attributed to the League of Nations or to its real author, Ragnar Nurksi. And that book made very clear that there was a broad consensus on a range of issues. They had a consensus that, for example, flexible exchange rates were bad because they could be unstable and could be manipulated, that there had to be an international source of liquidity of some kind. There were some points of disagreement, of course, not unimportant, such as between the Keynes plan and the White plan for the international agency. But there was a basic consensus on what was needed. Likewise, there was a concentration of power. The United States and its junior partner, Britain, were able to use the instruments of power, coercion, persuasion, cajoling, bribery, to get agreement. Compare that with the G20 today. And the G20 today, neither of these conditions are satisfied. Far from it. There is no consensus on basic principles on any of the issues that I've been talking about, on adjustment, and the issue of surveillance, on the management of financial markets, on the successor to the dollar. No consensus on these things. There was a brief shining moment when the G20 seemed to be effective. And that was in 2008 and going into 2009, when we were all scared, I'll be polite, scared out of our skins by the prospect of a new Great Depression. And there was a broad consensus that there had to be action taken in monetary policy and in fiscal policy to keep the world economy from going over the edge. Brief shining moment when interests were in harmony. But that's no longer true now. The emerging market economies that are doing better these days don't feel that they have the same pressures on them that the more mature economies do. Canada has led a coalition of governments in opposition to a bank tax being promoted by the US, some of the European powers, and Japan. There is essentially a breakdown on basic principles. No common ground within the G20. Likewise, there has been a diffusion of power. The US is still primus inter pares. The EU could be a major power if it acted together, but it doesn't. Japan is a silent partner. I just came back from Taiwan a week ago, where once upon a time, they hung on every word out of Japan, every event coming out of Japan. And I was there at the time when the Prime Minister of Japan resigned, and nobody wanted to talk about it. You know, as far as the Taiwanese were concerned, the only country to worry about is mainland China, not Japan. There has been a diffusion of power. Most importantly, it's been a diffusion of power in the sense of autonomy, not necessarily in a sense of influence, which is to say more countries like China, India, Brazil feel that they are, to some extent, free to go their own way, to act autonomously, but haven't yet achieved a degree of power sufficient to influence outcomes. And so the result is that we get less and less possibility of agreement. If we were to deal satisfactorily with the variety of issues that I've been talking about, with the surveillance issue, financial market management, the successor to the dollar, we would have to have an effective political strategy. We would have to have a serious effort to develop common ground on some of the key issues at hand. And secondly, we would have to, in the absence of dominant leadership, we would have to mobilize, with apologies for any echo of Iraq, a winning coalition here, a coalition of the willing, coalition of states sufficient to exercise influence to achieve what is commonly agreed. But of course, that's obviously easier said than done. This is one of those situations where we know what we need to do, it's just that it's not very easy to do it. So I feel like Bill Clinton at the Democratic Convention in 1988, I guess it was, when he was giving a speech, and it went on for so long that when he finally said, "In conclusion," the crowd cheered. And I feel that if I say "in conclusion," I may get the same reaction from you. But in conclusion, my sense is that for all the reasons I've just spelled out, really fundamental reform of the system is unlikely. I think that there will be incremental change, just as there has been for a very long time. On specific issues where common ground can be found and a winning coalition can be formed. But anything more fundamental than that, I suspect, for the reasons I've spelled out, is highly unlikely. We have muddled through, and we will continue to muddle through. Now, the question, of course, is how to characterize that kind of a conclusion. Am I being an optimist or am I being a pessimist? You know, one could say it sounds pessimistic. Fundamental reform is unlikely. We're going to muddle through. We're going to live with imperfection and suboptimality. But then, is that really pessimistic if you consider what the alternative might be or could have been just a couple of years ago? You know, it depends on your standard of comparison, right? Let me conclude just by reminding you what the definition of the difference is between an optimist and a pessimist. An optimist is like Dr. Pangloss in Candide by Voltaire, who goes around with a big smile on his face saying, "This is the best of all possible worlds." The pessimist is the person who nods his head or her head sadly and says, "I'm afraid I agree with you." So on that note, I will conclude, and I assume that there will be a little Q&A, and I look forward to your comments and your questions. Thank you very much for your attention.